This week marks the 5th anniversary of the Syrian uprising. In Geneva right now, the United Nations is trying to bring together the regime, the opposition, and the world powers that back both sides. Hello, I'm Matthew Moore in Istanbul with the first part of TRT World's week-long special coverage of Syria's conflict. Here is a look at what's happening in today's programme. Living under siege, we have a report from eastern Ghouta, one of the rebel-held areas around Damascus that has not received any international aid. How are the people surviving there after being targeted by the regime for 3 years? Plus, risking their lives to save others, we meet the leader of the Syria Civil Defence Brigade, the volunteers who rushed to the scene after an airstrike. Also known as the White Helmets, they say they've rescued 50,000 people across the country. And the cost of war. Unemployment has soared and entire industries have collapsed. We take a look at how 5 years of conflict have left the country's economy in ruins. And we ask if it can ever make a comeback. We also have our correspondent standing by across the region. Nicole Johnston is in the town of Gaziantep on the Turkish side of the border with Syria. Nicole will be reporting on the surgeons who are struggling to get in and out of Syria. And Zaina Awad is in Lebanon with a report from Tripoli, the city that's been put on edge by the influx of refugees. This is Syria, 5 years of conflict, living under siege. It started 5 years ago as part of the Arab Spring, inspired by pro-democracy protests that were sweeping the Middle East. People took to the streets of Syria, calling for the removal of Bashar al-Assad's regime. But 5 years on, the revolution has turned into a complex war involving many parties inside and outside the country. According to the United Nations, 500,000 people are currently living in besieged areas without access to food or medical supplies. Ali Mustafa has this report on life under siege in the Damascus suburb of eastern Ghouta.
Life is at a standstill in eastern Ghouta. This area has been under the control of the Jaish al-Islam opposition group for the past 3 years. Despite the regime siege, the rebel group remains popular.
Our rebel leaders are citizens. They're from the people. They will tell us when to stop fighting, not Russia or the UN.
Water became a precious resource here, and hand pumps an essential tool.
There's been no electricity for 5 years, and the water supply was cut off 3.5 years ago. The roads are blocked.
The power lines remain down. Nearly all transformers have been destroyed, so people had to improvise. They built this water turbine. The faster the water flows, the more power it generates.
We used to generate electricity using a bicycle. Later we modified it into a water wheel. After the modification, it's generating 22 volts. It can power a television and charge some batteries.
Smuggled gasoline is sold on the streets, but only a few businesses can afford it, like this tailoring shop that is run on generators. It's used to run the grinder and to sharpen the scissors, and also to run the sewing machines. A few vegetables are on display outside this store, but step inside and there's not much left. These shelves haven't been stocked for years now, and the refrigerators are empty. Whatever items remain cost too much for most residents.
The food prices are unbearable. Bashar al-Assad bombed everything we tried to plant.
No food crops grow in the soil of eastern Ghouta. Bombed out fields, a testament to 5 years of war. Not even the dead have been spared. Amid all the destruction, these children play on, their future uncertain in a war that's older than they are. Ali Mustafa, TRT World.
So that is life in eastern Ghouta. Let's take a look at some of the other besieged areas across Syria. And most are towns blockaded by the Syrian regime. In areas around Damascus, like Madaya, Zabadani, Diraya, Mudamiyat al-Sham, Yarmouk Camp, eastern Ghouta, as we've heard, and Douma. The regime has also laid siege to several places in the northern countryside of Homs. Meanwhile, rebel groups have surrounded the towns of Kafraya and Fua in the province of Idlib, while Daesh has cut off essential supplies to regime-held districts in the city of Deir ez-Zor. Well, Yusuf Abdullah is an aid worker with the NGO Islamic Relief in the besieged city of Idlib. He tells us what life is like for people living there.
Now Idlib is the only accessible city from the opposition areas, where, let's say, hundreds of thousands of people are living there with many IDPs and many challenges for international NGOs and who want to support the civilians in Idlib and the nearby areas. The Syrian people are very persisting and active people, and always trying to recover their civil life despite of the difficulties and the challenges.
How are the rebels running the province? I'm talking about water supplies, electricity, administration. Do civil servants get paid, for example?
Okay, basically now there is something now created in these areas called the local councils. They are the civilian agencies and bodies who are, let's say, managing these aspects of water and food and supplies for the civilians.
And how does your group, Islamic Relief, operate where there are several rebel groups in charge? How do you get, for example, permission to access those who need your help?
Okay, in fact, we are protected by the local community, which there's a desire for the international NGOs and local NGOs to support the civilians in the area. The people are in need here, and they do appreciate who is supporting and providing aid for the people. So this is somehow now easier, but regardless of the other security and difficulties, so we are operating with difficulties, but this is our obligation.
And as you know, the UN talks in Geneva have begun. Are you and your group and the people who live in Idlib hopeful that the talks in Geneva will succeed?
Okay, in fact, there is many opinions about the Geneva negotiations and the agreement. So some people are seeing that the future is vague, and some people are saying that the future will be better or worse, optimistic, pessimistic. This is depending on different perspectives for the crisis.
Well, the death toll is staggering. At least 250,000 Syrians have been killed in the past 5 years. That's according to the United Nations, but that number is from last year. Some rights groups think the death toll could be as high as 500,000. Well, the UN estimates that more than 1 million people have been wounded. Those numbers would be higher if it wasn't for the volunteers from the Syrian Civil Defense Brigade. TRT World spoke to the head of the group, also known as the White Helmets, and Andrew Hopkins has this report.
When there's an airstrike in Syria, it's a race against time. People can be trapped under rubble and clinging onto life. And that's when the White Helmets spring into action. But they're not welcomed by the Syrian regime.
The regime sees us as a threat because we are an organization working across Syria. We are a rival to regime institutions and are much stronger than theirs.
The organization started in 2013. It has 2,900 members operating in different parts of Syria, including 2 women's teams. And they say they've saved more than 50,000 lives. Members come from all walks of life, but they say the start of Russian airstrikes last year has left them struggling to cope.
The pressure on the rescue teams is huge. Honestly, the day before the latest ceasefire, there were more than 1,500 raids across Syria. I'm talking a massive number of raids, and 25 warplanes in the sky across Aleppo and Idlib. The rescue teams cannot respond to all these attacks.
And they're at risk of being killed themselves.
In December, we responded to an attack and found 5 injuries. After we sent 3 to hospital, another car was loading the rest when another strike hit. 90 people were killed, including one of our members. The whole team was affected.
The group receives training and is funded by international organizations and charities. And ultimately, members want to help their communities.
When you see women and children under rubble, it moves your feelings. You can see how we are training here, but when it comes to reality, it's something else. The scenes of destruction, rubble and the bombing are indescribable.
And while fighting continues in Syria, there will be plenty of scenes like that for the White Helmets to deal with. Andrew Hopkins, TRT World.
Let's talk to Lina Khatib now. She is a leading expert on the Middle Eastern politics and is the Senior Research Associate at the Arab Reform Initiative. She joins us now live from London. Lina, thank you very much for joining us. We heard in Andrew Hopkins' report there that the White Helmets are finding it increasingly difficult to do their job, to help people, ever since the Russians came into this conflict. What more can you tell us about the impact of Russia's involvement in Syria?
The Russian campaign in Syria has had very negative repercussions on the ground. First of all, as we heard, humanitarian agencies are not able to do their work because Russia is bombing indiscriminately. It is bombing civilian areas, not just military targets. The other thing that is happening is that the Syrian rebels who had tried to hold certain opposition areas are less able to do so. And that means that the Islamist groups on the ground are becoming also more powerful, and these groups do not treat civilians very well. The other issue is that, of course, the regime is gaining from the Russian campaign and using the Russian campaign in order to increase its sieges on many areas in Syria, which, of course, has very strong repercussions on the humanitarian level.
Lina, let's just pick up on that point about the besieged cities and other areas around Syria. A number of Syrians I spoke to in researching this program have said they're very frustrated that the United Nations is not doing more to apply pressure to the regime to get those sieges lifted. What do you make of that?
Absolutely. A lot of people are frustrated with the United Nations because they see it as, in a way, collaborating with the Syrian regime. The United Nations obviously says they need to, in a way, talk to the regime to be able to deliver aid in the first place. But the regime sometimes makes promises that it does not deliver on. So the promises that we have had regarding allowing aid have only actually been implemented in a very limited way. So the towns that have been besieged, like Madaya, have only received a fraction of the aid that should have reached them as a result of the regime's actions. And the UN does not want to upset the regime too much because this does not want to lose this kind of access, and therefore, in a way, it has become hostage to the Syrian regime's whims.
Lina Khatib in London, thank you very much for your analysis. Let's take a look at the role of Syrian doctors now, who are working on the front lines of the war. The group Physicians for Human Rights says more than 700 healthcare workers have been killed since the start of the conflict. They accuse the Syrian regime and its allies of carrying out most of the attacks. And many doctors have moved their families to Turkey and cross in and out of Syria. Now, Nicole Johnston joins us from the Turkish town of Gaziantep, near the Syrian border. Nicole, you've been meeting some of these doctors. What have they been telling you?
Yes, there are hundreds of Syrian doctors living in the southern part of Turkey with their families. As you said, they cross in and out of Syria. They say they have two main challenges at the moment. The first one is that the main road, the most direct route to get to Aleppo from southern Turkey, has been cut by regime forces. So they're having to take a much further route that adds hundreds of kilometres to their journey. They say the other big problem is Turkish bureaucracy. They're having trouble getting permission, in some cases, to cross in and out of Syria, and that's something they'd like to see addressed. And you can hear more about some of those challenges in this report.
From the Turkish border town of Kilis, Syrian doctors load medical supplies to take to Syria. There are stretchers, boxes of medicine and bandages. All this will go to a vast camp for Syrians who fled from their homes. It's called Bab al-Salama. In February, Turkey closed the border to Syria. However, doctors are still allowed to cross. There's only a handful of doctors using this major crossing into Syria now. They're taking in medical supplies and treating more than 100,000 people camped out near the border. It's exhausting, but every day they cross in and out of Syria. Dr. Mahmoud Mustafa says the Syrian-Turkish border is not secure, and so it's taking longer to cross.
For the last few weeks, the border crossing has become more difficult. The Turkish side caught people trying to enter Turkey with explosives, so it's become stricter.
It's been a devastating start to the year for Syrian doctors. On the 14th of February, 5 medical centres in Aleppo and Idlib province were bombed. Russia denied carrying out the attacks. In total, 50 people were killed, including medical staff and patients. Because of the war, around 350 Syrian doctors have moved their families to southern Turkey. Dr. Abdulaziz is one of them.
I feel myself divided between my family and my duty. Your duty, you have to be, I'm a surgeon, I have to be close to my patients.
Dr. Aziz says 100 Syrian doctors regularly cross the border, and he's urging Turkey to make it easier.
Please help Syrian doctor for humanitarian reason to go in and out freely.
Until then, Dr. Aziz is stuck in Turkey, enjoying being home with his family, but at the same time longing to be in Syria where he's needed.
Radiologist and this man surgeon, this is surgeon, this is new.
Nicole, it sounds like these Syrian doctors are really stretched in that camp across the border.
That's right. As you heard, this is a vast camp. Some of the doctors told us they believe there could be up to 150,000 people there. More people are arriving every day. At the beginning of the year, 40,000 people arrived just in a matter of a few days. They say that they don't have enough resources, that in some areas of the camp the conditions are appalling, that our children are getting sick because of those camp conditions. They're doing their best to cross in and out of Syria. Around 14 doctors every morning go in, and then in the afternoon they go out. But they said they really need a lot more help for the people in that camp.
Nicole Johnson in Gaziantep, thank you for that report. Now, the war in Syria has had repercussions across the region, and perhaps nowhere more so than in neighbouring Lebanon. The two countries have a lot of connections. The Sunni-Shia tension seen in Syria can also be witnessed in Lebanon. Let's go to Zaina Awad now. She joins us from Beirut. Zaina, you've been visiting the north of the country. Tell us more about what you found there.
Well, Matt, we spent 2 days in the northern city of Tripoli. It's Lebanon's second largest city, and it's home to a Sunni population and an Alawite Lebanese population who have come head-to-head confrontations repeatedly over the last few years. Now, interestingly, these communities have strong linkages to Syria. Many of them have intermarried with Syrians over the years. They're ideologically and culturally linked, and that is why, for them, the war in Syria is personal.
Tripoli, on Lebanon's northern coast. Nowhere has the question of what direction Lebanon should take been fought over more than in this ancient Mediterranean city.
This is Syria Street. To my left is Jabal Muhsin, home to one of the largest Alawite communities. And to my right is Beit Tabbani, a Sunni neighborhood and a stronghold of the Syrian revolution. This is the dividing line, and this street witnessed some of the fiercest battles in Lebanon since the war in neighboring Syria begun.
And in this battle, nowhere is holy. 3 years ago, 2 mosques were bombed during Friday prayers. Dozens were killed. The sheikhs had been using their pulpits to call on young Sunni men to join the revolution in Syria.
We in Tripoli have become an extension of Homs.
Sheikh Baroudi was preaching at one of the 2 mosques when it was bombed.
When the Syrian revolution started, refugees started coming here, and we began a campaign to house them and help them with their needs.
Men from the neighboring Alawite community have been arrested in connection with the bombings.
Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra have been fighting us. Their flags were being raised in this area. Religious men and politicians were giving them protection and political cover.
The Alawite and Sunni communities in Tripoli are among the poorest in the country. The border is less than a 2-hour drive. People here have been intermarrying with Syrians for the last 60 years. Blood ties with their faith brethren across the border has brought Syria even closer.
We are sitting on top of a volcano. Any moment, it can blow up in a dangerous way. We could have another Iraq.
Tension continues to bubble below the surface here. This has become a city where uneasy calm is the new normal.
Zaina, in your report, we heard someone saying, we are sitting on top of a volcano. At any moment, it can blow up in a dangerous way. We could have another Iraq. He's talking about Lebanon. Is the government capable of preventing such a thing?
Well, Matt, the government in this country is very divided. In fact, it hasn't been able to elect a president since May 2014, and it's divided along the lines of Saudi Arabia versus Iran. One part of the parliament is aligned with Saudi Arabia, the other is with Iran. But interestingly, the Lebanese army has actually been able to do its job. It's an institution that's been credited with rising above the sectarian divisions and maintaining the peace. Everywhere we went in the north, we saw Lebanese checkpoints. They're everywhere. If you want to pass from one to the other, you have to present paperwork. At one of them, we were held up for 40 minutes. And they say that they need to be there in order to make sure that the Lebanese don't go back to fighting each other in the streets. There are also parts of North Lebanon that are under complete lockdown because the Lebanese army is in there fighting Sunni fighters, both Lebanese and Syrians who've come back from Syria, including Daesh.
Zaina Awad in Beirut, thank you very much for that report. Syria once had a promising economy with prosperous agricultural, energy and mining industries. But today, the economy is in tatters. The last time Syria released GDP figures was in 2013, when the economy was estimated to be worth around $35 billion. That's nearly half of what it was worth in 2011. Over the last 5 years, Syria's inflation has climbed by nearly 60%. The Syrian pound has depreciated by more than 80% over the same period. Oil production is down from almost 400,000 barrels a day to less than 10,000, a 97% drop. Meanwhile, Daesh is producing nearly 6 times that amount per day. Electrical power generation is down by 70%. Since all electrical power is fueled by natural gas, major sections of Syria's pipelines have either been destroyed or in disrepair. Syria's biggest export earner used to be phosphate, bringing in around $100 million a year back in 2011. But what little remains of pre-war oil and phosphate production is now mostly under Daesh control. For more on this, let's speak to TRT World's editor-at-large, Craig Kapitas, who joins us now live from Paris. Craig, can Syria ever return, under the right political circumstances, of course, to what it was? Can it ever recover?
Doing that requires a moral conviction on the part of many people. Sadly, moral conviction costs money. And I think the best way to look at this situation is compare it to the Marshall Plan, which took place to rebuild Europe after World War II. The Marshall Plan in 2016 dollars cost $130 billion to rebuild and put Europe back on its feet. The experts we've spoken to in preparation for this week's programs put that cost at higher than $130 billion. But the problem is a lot of the data coming out of Syria right now, data that businessmen need to move, is counterfactual.
Just very quickly, Craig, would international investors ever be willing to go back into Syria?
Well, you know, Matt, idealism is fine, but as it approaches reality, the cost becomes prohibitive. And this is what we're looking at here. Look, the UNHCR says some 3 million people have fled, about 6.5 million have been displaced. The first question you have to ask is, will the diaspora return to Syria to create a worker base? No one has an answer to that. And if they do, the Syrian business community that existed under Assad was crony capitalism at its worst. These were people who do not value economic rights, they valued economic privileges. And this cadre of individuals is not really prepared for a 21st century economy. Could Syria be fixed? Yes. Is there a will to repair Syria, turn it back into some sort of economic glory? Yes. But everyone we've spoken with, they just don't know where the money's going to come from.
Craig Kapitas in Paris, thank you for your analysis. Well, that is the end of the first part of our special week-long coverage of the war in Syria. We'll leave you now with some of the most harrowing moments photographers have captured for another perspective on life under siege.